This is January 30th, 2006. We are at the Richard B. Russell Library for Political Research and Studies at the University of Georgia, Athens, Georgia. I'm Ieda Siqueira Wiarda. I am a professor here at the University of Georgia, and I'm also on the staff of the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. I'll be interviewing Margaret R. Bennett and the widow of former Ambassador William Tapley Bennett. It's not only a pleasure, but also it's an honor for me to be interviewing her. I have been talking with her for a few minutes during breakfast, and I have learned a good many things about her and my appreciation of her. After having seen her CV and her husband's CV, I now am even more impressed. So it's just a delight to be here and also for us to have this conversation about herself, about her husband, who was, I believe, the longest serving diplomat in the diplomatic corps, which is really quite an honor.
I don't think he was quite the longest serving, but at the time he was the longest serving.
Yeah, and probably that is still there. I wouldn't be surprised. So I'm very happy to be here, very honored to be here, and this will be a conversation. So that people know where I'm coming from, I'm a Brazilian, but I have been working with the American government in various ways at the Foreign Service Institute, and also I was telling Mrs. Bennett that the first time that I came to this country to be chosen as an exchange student, that was the first time that I was on and giving a television interview. And I must have passed because I was chosen and lived with a family in Houston, Texas. That was to this day, and I have had many other good experiences, but to this day, living with an American family was really extraordinary. So I come with a very open mind about the United States. The United States has been very good to me, and it is an honor, truly an honor, and a pleasure to be interviewing Margaret Bennett. So I'd like to start asking a few questions that I hope she can tell us a little bit about herself and also a little bit about her role as a diplomat spouse. Because she has been in many of the countries that also I have been, and I'm always interested in the nuances in her own experience. And the first thing that I would like to ask you, is there a way, if there is such a way, I don't think there is, but maybe you are going to tell me that there is, to prepare you to be a diplomat spouse abroad?
Well, first of all, before we get into that, I'd like to thank you for your gracious words, and particularly for your appreciation for the U.S., because I think in this day and age, we in the U.S. don't necessarily feel that we are appreciated, and we do try. Getting back to preparation, I'd be put to it to say that there is such a thing as preparation for living abroad. It's a matter, I think, a great deal of the individual. I was lucky because my parents were for a foreign service, and the first post abroad that I remember was Buenos Aires, which happened between the time that I was 7 and 11. And then we went to Berlin, which was Hitler, Germany. And in both countries, I was plunked in the schools of the country, so I had to learn the languages, and that is the way to learn the language quickly, because if you like to talk, which I do, you obviously want to be able to express yourself, so you learn the language. And then my parents were assigned to Calcutta for 4 years. My father was consul general there, and that was the day of the Raj. So he had the whole of India and was assigned to Afghanistan as well, and they traveled there. I had a summer visiting them there. And then they had 5 months in Tangier, and then came back for about 2 months leave while he was being well, went through the senatorial confirmation process for minister to Haiti. At that time it was a legation. And then when the legations were all raised to embassies, he became the first ambassador to Haiti and then went on to be ambassador to Peru. And they were rather annoyed at me for getting engaged in planning my wedding in June of '45 because they had planned a nice leisurely trip around the southern hemisphere, but that didn't happen. And then my father, after a few months in that sort of place where they declassifying documents, things that the State Department does, retired completely, and they retired to Maryland and built a house by stages because you had to remodel to begin with, and then you could build it. And it became my children's home away from home. It was the house with the attic. But that said, so in a way, I was prepared for the fact that, I believe my first sentence was in 4 languages, 4 words. And so I was prepared for the fact that different people thought differently. And I think that's probably an essential thing that you need to think about, because a lot of people go abroad and the first thing they say is, well, why don't they have a complete drugstore? Why don't they have well, now supermarkets exist almost everywhere, but back in my day they didn't.
Everywhere.
And my parents had really traveled rough. They had to take their own supplies with them everywhere, and I suppose if you were assigned to Kyrgyzstan now, it would be more like what some of the postings were like in those days. So, have I answered your question?
Well, yes, and also prompted because of your first words to me. Not only I appreciate, but I have to tell you something. How, even before that interview for coming to the United States, I'm from Belo Horizonte, I used to go to the Lincoln Center, the U.S. Brazilian Institute. And I remember as a very young girl, I would go to that library and I just marveled at the books that they had there. And as a very young child, not only I would marvel at the books, but also they smelled good. I remember the clean smell. And that's where I learned my English. Well, also in high school, you had to have 4 years of English and so on. But I really wish, and this I'm going to put a plug right now, we really need to bring back those bicultural centers, because that is the best face of the United States. You have films, you have classes in English, you have all kinds of exchanges, and especially the books.
Yes.
As you know, a few years ago, for whatever reason, I don't even know in which administration, those things were closed down. Yes. And people miss them. I know I miss them. And lots of others that would have been exposed to a face of America, literature, art, culture, and so on. They don't find it anymore. They don't find those nice smelling books,
We were traveling in, I guess it was '85, after my husband had retired. He was making speeches on behalf of the government around Australia, and we fetched up in Sydney, and the Consul General there was a friend of ours, and he said, I'm going to take you to dinner tomorrow night. It's an occasion I think you'll find entertaining. And I sort of about it. But anyhow, off we went, and we went to the oldest pub in Sydney, which dated back to convict times, and it looked like a real English pub. And there was I think just may still be the Prime Minister of New South Wales, but at that time he was just an MP, and he didn't have enough to do, so he had organized the Chester A. Arthur Trivia Club. Oh. And they used to go to the USIS libraries and think up questions about American presidents. And then the person who won the quiz would get to talk about his favorite president. And we lucked out because we heard about Harry Truman. But the winner of that evening was going to talk about Nixon the next time. But I thought to myself, where in the United States would you ever find a club that was devoted to the trivia of, say, British monarchy? I mean, it might be the British monarchy. You might possibly get something about the French, but I cannot imagine anything like that anywhere in this country. But Anyway, getting back to our muttons.
No, but I still miss, whenever I go abroad, and I go abroad quite often, I still miss not being able to visit those bicultural centers, because that was really a great face of the United States. Let's hope that it comes back. Now, going back to your own experiences and so on, for a young person, a diplomat's spouse or partner, would you give, what kind of advice would you give, even though I realize that things have changed both in the United States and abroad, and the relationship now is in many ways more complex and more daunting. But what advice would you give from your own experience?
Well, you have to realize that, and as you said, things have changed. In my day, the ambassador and the ambassador's wife very definitely set the tone, and wives were expected to be part of the team. We figured in the efficiency reports, and you expected to do things, and you felt proud of being part of the United States team. In 1972, because of the excesses of three ladies who shall be nameless, one of them had asked a junior wife to iron her tablecloths because she didn't think her servants could do it. Now, that was a bit much, to put it mildly, and things like that. And so the department said, from now on, wives are not to be mentioned in efficiency reports. And so we weren't part of the team anymore. We were just nothing. And different people took it different ways. Some of the new, sort of the middle level wives said, oh, well, we aren't going to go to the ambassador's receptions anymore. We don't count, so therefore we won't go, which was cutting off their nose to spite their faces, because then they complained because they didn't meet people of the country. And I think my real advice would be to be outgoing, but not to expect people necessarily to respond to overtures right away, but to certainly be friendly and at all levels, and to have good manners.
That always helps. There's no doubt about it. So, but also what I have been impressed, talking to you and so on, that obviously you had a very keen appreciation for the culture. And I would not be surprised if, when your husband was assigned to a certain place, to a certain post, to a certain country, that you read about the culture, you tried to become familiar with it before you went, to prepare yourself. I'm sure you did.
Well, we didn't really have very much time in most of our postings, because when we finally went abroad, we went to Vienna. And I mean, I'd had a certain amount of history, world history, and I'm a history buff, which helps. And we got there, and I did speak German before I got there, but it's not the same German. And you just went on, and you met the people you had to meet, and you treated them like people of interest, and so on. And then we thought we were going to Rome, and Tap actually got there for a month. I went down because our chargé was giving a party to introduce us to the Romans 2 weeks into the assignment, and that day I was taking a bath, and Tap burst in and said, "It's a good thing you're lying down, because I've just been transferred to Athens and I'm to be there next week."
Athens?
Athens, Greece. Oh yes, we've had Vienna West and East, and we've had Athens East and West. But anyway, my only thought was, why the dickens couldn't they have told us sooner, and then I'd have organized the packing differently. Sure. But Tap was really crushed, because he'd fallen in love with Rome and all that. We'd been studying Italian from German, which is not the most felicitous combination. We had carried the servants of our predecessor for 6 months, and the apartment was part of it, came with a job, so that we didn't have to house hunt, but it was rather going to be a tight squeeze. Actually, we were peeling off our eldest to boarding school, and but even so, holidays. And I was rather thinking, this is too good to be true, and it was. But anyhow, the Tap hung on by his fingernails and said he wasn't going to leave until after Queen Elizabeth's state visit. And it turned out he was acting chargé that evening because the chargé developed a tummy trouble. So his wife and we went, and we actually got to meet Queen Elizabeth and Prince Phillip. And at that time, Prince Phillip was very much carrying the ball and socially, and she looked rather frightened. Now it's a different story.
I was going to say things changed.
They've changed considerably. The last time when we met them at NATO, Phillip was definitely relegated to the lower ranks.
Right. Yeah, I have seen both of them.
We went directly to Athens, and we certainly had no preparation for that. But I think in a way that was the post I got the most out of, because I worked terribly hard at learning Greek. I had an arrangement with my teacher that he would come at 12 noon and stay until Tap got home for lunch, which was sometimes 3 o'clock. And it was, so I really worked hard at my Greek, and the Greeks are extremely friendly and hospitable. And it was also a lovely relief to get there, because Austria was extremely hierarchical, despite being a republic, and it's also an inland country, and the Danube is no substitute for the sea, and so all told, I just felt I'd been liberated when I got to Greece, and every man there knows that it's just the luck of the draw that he isn't Onassis, and he's just as good as everybody else. And I mean, for instance, our drivers would bring the children to somebody's house for a parade or something like that, and he'd go around and shake hands with everybody, which wouldn't have been done in Austria. Sure. And then he wouldn't stay, but everybody knew him, and it was quite accepted. That was sort of such a pleasant change. And then from Greece we went to Dominican Republic direct, and there again, I mean, one always read what one could, and we about the postings.
But you were also very fortunate that you had your family history. So this, in many ways, your pre-marriage kinds of experience really had a very positive impact. You pretty much knew somehow how to behave yourself, what to expect, and above all, to really be, as the wife of the ambassador or the ambassador, the face of the Americans right there in that country, and that's tough.
Well, it was very funny because my father joined the Foreign Service in 1914, and he was supposed to go to Mexico as his first posting, and then Pancho Villa acted up, and so Mr. Wilson would have none of it, and so instead my father's first posting was the Dominican Republic, and he ended up being in charge very shortly because his minister had been called home for peculation. And
there's another word for that right now.
Yes, but anyway, so he had a revolution to deal with, and he'd have to ride out to Santiago, and he pointed out to the
Santiago de los Caballeros there.
Yes. Well, actually, it was Vega, I think, that what he wrote out to, but he pointed out to the rebelling general that if he fired on Santo Domingo, that there wouldn't be much left for him to take. And I think this was all done in a very civilized fashion. Tap's revolution wasn't quite as easy.
Yeah, sure. Because at this time, was the time that the Marines were sent into Dominican Republic?
The Marines came in, I think, in 20-something. I think it was in the 20s. And I know because my father was being a minister to Haiti, we had the other side of the island too, and I think one of the Haitians told my father, the trouble with you Americans is that if you just left us alone, our presidents would have embezzled, but they would have embezzled within reason, because otherwise they knew we'd chop off their heads. But you came in, so now they just take the whole country.
Oh, yes. But one of the things that's very clear from you is that you were very conscious that maybe some of the people that you're meeting, not necessarily as the wife of the diplomat, but when you were, with the chauffeur, when with other people and so on, you knew that you might have been the first and only American that they had ever met, and they may make a conception about Americans based on the way that you behaved, how you relate with them, and so on. I'm sure you were aware of that. And
subconsciously.
No, I'm sure.
But really, actually, when you come down to it, I suppose the closest friends we had were our employees.
Sure.
I mean, the chauffeur in Greece,
Sure.
and the household in Lisbon. In the long run, the other relationships tended to be more formal,
Sure,
and
sure.
but you really knew those people.
Yeah, and I was going to ask you what you found that was useful in different situations. And first I was going to say to break the barriers, but that's not a good image. And I know this is not exactly the metaphor. I like better to say melting the barriers, because if you break the barriers, you are going to have some pieces left on the ground and you have to deal with them. So breaking the barriers is not as good as melting them. Trying to present yourself as the American, there is a question and you try to, to put yourself in that person's position, and to what extent can you come to some sort of agreement, or at least not come to blows?
Well, I suppose when we were in Lisbon, which was after the Dominican Republic, this was in the last 2 years of the dictator Salazar's time.
Yes, right.
Tapp met him a couple of times, but he was pretty much of a recluse then, and our dealings were more with, well, we knew President Tomas, who was
Sure.
a nice
Yeah.
former admiral, and the foreign minister, who was a prickly character, Franco Nogueira. But I found that the Portuguese were very hospitable in a way, but much more reserved as a society than the others that we had met. And it might have been because I was older than when we were in Austria, but in Austria it was somehow easier to break into the, I use the word break into the group, because it wasn't so much melting, but you either were, or you got in, or you didn't. But it was a very formal society, and very interesting to me in some ways. We had a social secretary, which was the first time I'd had such a thing, and it was really quite something. But it was very helpful, and she was her family really were extraordinary, because they managed to outlive any regime that came along, and they were infiltrated in all branches of the government, so they knew exactly what was what.
To survive.
So it was very convenient. I was never too sure that how indiscreet I could be around her, but she was very helpful. But one time we had a wonderful time, because there's a Pinto Basto family there, and they must have about, well, at least 200 members who circulate, and they seem to take it in turns as to who's going to do what with whom. And the secretary was away, so I called up, and we wanted to get Mr. Anselmo Pinto Basto for lunch, and his nickname was Rob Roy. So I called up and I asked, could I speak to Mrs. Pinto Basto? And she said, speaking. And it didn't sound like Donna Teresa's voice, but I didn't think anything of it, so I invited them to lunch. And I said, I will send you a reminder, which I duly did, addressed to Anselmo and Senora. Well, lunch came, in walked 2 younger Pinto Bastos, and obviously the family had decided that the lunch was more suitable for them than for
the older.
Or anyhow, they knew exactly what had happened. Sure. The only thing that was ever said afterwards, I bumped into Rob Roy subsequently. He said, you have a very nice handwriting. That was it. So I mean, we didn't seem to get out so much in the provinces in Portugal as we had elsewhere. The Portuguese at that time were very much on the defensive because of the well,
the civil wars in Africa,
independence movements and wars in Angola and Mozambique. But we were very lucky because they always wanted ambassadors to travel around to the overseas territories, as they call them. So we did get to visit a large part of Angola and a certain amount of Mozambique, and they're huge parts of the world. So that getting around, we had to accept the use of planes of companies and that sort of thing, which our government was frowning upon. But how else do you get around?
You just couldn't.
But that said, one of the things that has struck me around the world is when you get out of the capital cities, you get into the more provincial cities, they're very similar the world over. And particularly if there's a Latin origin, you find that it's very, in Angola and Mozambique, most of the officials' wives didn't speak anything excepting Portuguese. And I was so grateful that I could at least murder Portuguese, because it ruined my Spanish. But anyhow, it was always, you had, if you had children, it was such an advantage because you could babble on about children, whereas if they didn't have children, that took out a whole topic of conversation. And it was, we talked about, you could talk about gardening, not that I was a gardener, but anyway. I remember on a visit to Izmir, from when we were at NATO, we stopped and there was a large luncheon, and I was plunked down between, I forget who was on my left, but on my right was an Air Force general. And being Turkish, I don't think he was overly accustomed to making polite conversation to the female of the species, but anyway, there we were.
He struggled.
And the interpreter was across the table from us, so I asked the general, "What do you do in your spare time?" And he said, "Oh, I like to garden." I thought, thank heavens. So I asked him every flower I could think of. I don't know what the poor interpreter said to him, but the general seemed to be quite happy, and I was certainly
Well, you could have talked about tulips, because tulips are supposed to have started in Turkey.
Well, as I say, we got into all that, but I never was quite sure what the poor colonel was having to do, because I don't think his language training had included gardens particularly.
Oh, that's interesting. But what you say about Portugal, see, my husband and I also lived in Portugal for a time. My youngest child was born there. And language, of course, was not a problem.
No.
But it's a much more, is probably the most reserved country that I have ever visited or lived in, and I have lived in many places, not as many as yours.
Yes, we go.
But people are very, very, even after their so-called revolution in the 1970s, and I go there every other year and so on, and they are still very, very reserved. They don't open up. They're very friendly, they're very good, but they don't,
it's a surface
it's reserved.
Relationship.
Yeah.
But we'd go over to Spain and we wouldn't know what had hit us, because we'd get the noise level was just unbelievable, whereas everything in Portugal then was so quiet. That has changed a bit.
Yeah, it has changed.
It's much more open as a society, and I mean, in our day you didn't have a single billboard on a wall. Now you have all sorts of posters up, and it
some good, some bad.
Well, what they say, that's their privilege.
But it is a much, even now, and I was there a couple of years ago, still more reserved. And it's about the only place that I'm always called a madame, and I'm always struck, people call me madam, It's a little bit daunting for a Brazilian to be called madam, because I'm just not used to that. But were you able to visit, I'm sure you were, visit some of the galleries there that they have?
Oh, yes, I used to go out to Queluz. I loved that palace there, which was the part of the Gulbenkian collection.
Yeah, Gulbenkian is extremely good.
Then they built the new building just before we left. I think it was just before we left, yes. And no, I used to go to all the galleries, and we did travel around a great deal, but we just didn't meet people it was mostly travel. We didn't really meet very many people up country. Occasionally we did. We had one gentleman in Oporto who took us around, and his name incidentally was Russell, and he looked rather like Senator Russell too, which was really rather amusing.
Russell Wood?
No. He was a Portuguese.
Oh,
His
I
surname
see.
was Russell.
Okay, because Russell Wood has written a number of books about
No.
Portugal.
This was not somebody
Yeah.
who's been published. He
Yeah.
was just
Yeah.
a local gentleman. And,
Yeah, but as you know, in Portugal there was quite a bit, and still there are a number of firms that have
I know.
the wonderful wine. They are all named, they are old
I
families
know.
that came from England.
Our consul, Juan Gorel's daughter, married I forget which winery it was. She married into a wine company. And then we did make very good friends with a couple who were with the name.
Sandeman?
No. It's the one who makes a quite good port, and
so we'll come
it'll
back.
come to me.
It will
But
come
I'm
back
sorry.
in the middle of the
This has
night.
been happening to me more and more
Oh
recently.
yeah, all of us. I'm sorry to say. Now, to what extent, once you came back to the United States and your husband had pretty much retired, your husband
it's always culture shock coming back to the U.S. and it's culture shock going abroad. But I think the thing that one always notices most is that when you move abroad, there are helping hands that you can call upon to help you move in. Mm-hmm. When you come back to the States, you're on your own, and it's really that part's difficult. But for instance, moving abroad, when we first went to Vienna, we had 5 children plus collie dog with us, and we were plunked in a pension on the 5th floor.
And no elevator?
And there was an elevator, but anybody under the age of 12 could not ride unaccompanied. So it was sort of like the goat and the wolf and the bag of feed crossing the river with only room for 2. And so I finally said that nobody was going to ride there, we were all going to walk up, and I must say it was very good for the figure.
But when you came back to the U.S., not necessarily the time that you're, retiring, but at what point were you also involved in debriefing, especially debriefing and having an exchange with the wives that were going to go abroad? Because that would have helped them. I have no doubt about that.
Well, I didn't get any briefings for going abroad. I'm not sure how much was available, but anyhow, I didn't avail myself of it. I did get to a briefing for chiefs of missions wives that was given, and I didn't feel that it taught me very much, and maybe I was a little bit feeling very superior because of having grown up in it, but as I say, I just didn't get very much chance to do it, and then I was never asked to brief other wives.
I wish, they
now,
really
what we
should.
did do in my day, you used to have, you did have meetings of the wives in the Post, and I remember putting out a protocol booklet for the wives, one of which was having come from the Dominican Republic, where all the domestics would put up their hair in pink curlers, and half the time would meet you at the front door with a pink curler, but some of the wives did too. So I said, nobody will be seen in public in pink curlers. Well, we had our political counselor's wife was at the hairdresser's one day, and there was some kind of a fire alarm or something like that, and so she was under the dryer, and so they motioned her out. Well, she carefully took her hair down because she said, "What would Mrs. Bennett say?"
Especially if her picture was shown in the paper, that would have been disastrous.
But I found that quite sometimes this wasn't such a good idea, because quite frequently things had changed by the time I'd gotten there, and I was still going on the old thing, and I unwisely did it a little bit early on, but nobody suffered unduly as a result.
But again, I think it's the idea that you had, and tell me if I'm wrong, that especially if they are Americans, they are the face of America.
Oh.
And so they have to be careful. They have to dress in a certain way. They have to express themselves in a certain way. They have to censor themselves in certain ways, so that, you know, whatever is perceived of America, because they are the Americans that some people, this is the only American they will ever meet.
Well, I mean, that part I was very conscious of, and that's one reason why we did have the protocol notes in the various posts that I went to. But as I say, I don't know what happened after 1972, because when we went to NATO, it was such a very different posting. It was first of all 70%, I think, defense, and only 30, or maybe it was 60% defense, and only 40% state. So, and it was very interesting because I would try to have a wives meeting, and of course wives now felt that they didn't have to do anything. Some of the old timers would turn up and I'd have a coffee. I mean, purely social. And the State Department wives almost never came, excepting for one or two. And the defense ladies all came very dutifully. But then, of course, a lot has to do with you get this with volunteer business too. When we were at the UN, there was a women's club, and we took it in turns to have a national. We had a monthly tea, and each nation would take it in turn. Well, it came to be our turn, and my husband was deputy chief of mission, but I was also secretary of the organization. And so I was looking around for some help, and I got a very nice major's wife who volunteered to do the food. And so afterwards I said to her, well, I hope you'll give me a list of so that we can pass on the do's and don'ts. She said, you know, when my husband joined the army, we junior wives had to hop to and do everything. Now I want to know, where are the junior wives? That's the story everywhere now in this country and everywhere else.
Yes, it's a very different kind of set up culture and expectations from all sides.
It was interesting too, because while we were just about the time we went to NATO, the other countries were having problems with the wives, and should you pay wives to attend a function, or to give a dinner, and how, in that case, how much would you pay I mean, it's absolutely impossible to deal with, really, and as I see it, because I mean, you can't divorce your meals really from your official function.
Sure, yeah, it's all tied up. And I know that you have been very involved in various ways with the National Cathedral in Washington.
Yeah.
And I was thinking whether, for example, in Dominican Republic, I recall, if I'm not mistaken, there was, and there still is, an Episcopal church there.
Yeah.
To what extent did you go to different churches or try to be part of some of the meetings that they had and community kind of outreach, or you did not do that, it was not expected or wanted of you?
I would go to services at the cathedral, and we knew the bishop and his wife quite well, and they were very involved in things, and I asked if I could help out, but they were chancy times, and it's the only way I can express it. And I didn't get very much involved then in that. What we did in the embassy with the wives, I had a meeting of the wives, and I said, we need to do something. But I know that from experience that everything that the previous ambassador's wife has done is never done by the succeeding ambassador's wife. And you know, one's predecessor is a rogue and something else, and one's successor is an incompetent. So when each person likes to do something something different. And so I'd like you to pick something that it won't matter if it isn't too much, if it isn't continued. So what they decided to do was to take on the the babies ward in the Robert Reed Hospital.
Oh yeah, okay.
And so some of us went and would cuddle the babies and feed them, just to give them a little bit more human touch, because there were, I think, 4 nuns who were dealing with a whole ward.
Hundreds of
I mean,
kids
they
and so-
tried, but
yeah.
they obviously couldn't
Yeah.
do everything. And then those who had small children and felt that they either shouldn't go and give germs or get germs, would do the sewing for them. And so we had quite a busy operation in doing that. And oh my! First time I went there, the babies. The culture was that you only went to the hospital if you had exhausted all other possibilities, and you really went because you were going to die. I mean,
Sure.
there was that mentality. And these are the babies of the very poor people, and they'd probably been fed on tea the whole time, so they were completely emaciated. You've seen these pictures of the starving children in Darfur and so forth. Well, very, very similar. I mean, these absolute little skeletons. And the sad part was that you'd get them nursed back to almost health, and then the bed would be needed for somebody else, and they'd be let go just a little bit too soon. And of course, they'd go, but you try to tell the mothers, you give them something solid, and you tell them what it was, but they wouldn't have the money. And sometimes it was just the problem that the parents weren't married, and the father would be. The more children he had, the more macho and so forth he'd be perceived.
More wives.
And so he would play around, of course, too. And the mother would be trying to hold on to him, so she'd give him all her earnings, which would be spent on everything else, so the children would suffer accordingly. So it was a very sad circle. We'd get the babies back maybe twice, and the third time the baby wouldn't.
And if either the mother or the father was a Haitian, as often is the case in the Dominican Republic, then it was, as you know, even more problematic.
Well, I never knew who the parents were. But I took my twins went and helped out there, and one of them really considered it a very important part of her life that she'd done this. And she's adopted a Romanian. Well, she was a 22-month-old, and this is my skating grandchild.
Oh, the one that you just went to. And, that's wonderful.
It's meant a great deal to her.
Yeah, so the tradition is continuing. Good for you. And speaking of tradition, I know you and your husband have been extremely generous and involved at the University of Georgia. And how did it come about that he gave his incredible papers that are so valuable in so many historical, diplomatic ways? They are here in this building, I believe, correct?
Well, he was a great admirer of Senator Russell's to start out with, and he was an admirer of Dean Russ, and at one point they had hoped he would come to be the dean, whatever that professorship is, but that didn't work out at the time, and so Marty Hillenbrand came instead. But he was an associate professor here after he retired, and I guess Cheryl can answer that better than I can. I don't really know why. I knew that, but I guess they asked for them.
Well, but also he was an alum, right?
Oh, he was an alumnus of the University of Georgia.
His family is also.
Yes, no, I mean he was a Georgian from the word go.
So there was that connection?
Yes, he used to get a great deal of mileage out of saying that when we were in the Dominican Republic and there'd be the signs up on the wall, Yankee, go home. He said he knew it wasn't he.
He was a Confederate, you know. He could be, so yeah, that's interesting. I never thought about that, yes, okay.
But the other thing he used to enjoy was, get out and take me with you, was the sign that was on one of the signs.
Oh, sure. Now, were you were not bodily present when things blew up in the Dominican Republic?
No, I was up in the States because
in 1964.
The four older children were all in, one was in college and the other three were in boarding school. And I had come up because they were all having staggered spring vacations. They were all at different places. And I'd stayed on because Tap kept saying he was coming up. We knew we were sitting on a volcano, and he knew he had to, if he was going to come up, he was going to have to come up soon. So he did come up finally, and got here, went to a wedding in Atlanta, and was driving out to Carnesville, where his parents lived, when he heard on the radio that there had been that the revolution had started, which apparently it was not meant to do that weekend, but somebody jumped the gun.
I see.
So
The word leaked out or something.
he promptly went back up to Washington, where I was more or less, and we had friends who'd had a revolution erupt under them when they were in Cyprus, so they were most understanding, and we stayed with them. They lived around the corner, roughly from where our house was in Washington, so we stayed with them. And so on Monday, Tap said to me, I saw him when he put his head on the pillow, literally, and when he took off in the morning, and then so he said to me, I don't know what my life's going to be, so you go ahead and have your own. So I was taking my best friend, who also lived around the corner, and I was taking her out to my parents' place, which is on Kent Island, Maryland, an hour and 15 minutes drive, roughly. And we went out and had lunch, and then we came back into town. She said, come and have tea. And I said, no, I think I better get back and see what's going on. I arrived around the corner, and there was the official car, and Tap was coming down the steps to be flown back to the Dominican Republic. So I piled into the car with him, and we had to drive down to Andrews Air Force Base, and then they very kindly brought me back again. And then he was put on the box and then went ashore, and I think most of his movements have been documented since. But it was really rather grim because the planes were no longer flying, so mail didn't go. I guess you could write by the pouch. And with hindsight, I know darn well what I should have done. I should have organized all the wives who'd been evacuated and so forth, but my only thought was to not be a nuisance to the department.
Sure.
I'd been told so long, all my childhood, do not rock the boat, so I didn't gather the wives together and try to make their morale better, et cetera, et cetera. But I would have Dominicans calling me up saying, can't you do something about my family, et cetera, et cetera. Well, I'd say, well, I'll be glad to pass it along, but I'm afraid I can't. I don't think anything can happen because I can't.
Could you communicate regularly?
The only communication we had which was something we started sooner, but because of my father-in-law's chancy health, we had a very nice Baptist minister, Dr. Shoemake, and he was a ham radio thing, and so he would patch us in, and then and Mr. Talley in I think it's Lisbon he lived in, Georgia, would then patch in at the other end, and so we would have we could communicate by ham radio at 6 a.m. and that was very unsatisfactory because, you know, you want to react to what somebody says, and you have to wait until that person says over, and then you talk, and then you have to remember to say over, and you know that everybody is listening in. So, and then the conversations would go something like, well, how are things going for you? Well, I'm alive, sort of thing, and then, when do you think I can come down? Well, why don't you book on the next Pan Am flight, which next week? And well,
but the flights were not going.
They weren't going, but I mean, we were just keeping up this idea, which was very unsettling. And so we, for about 3 months, we went through this charade.
You were here, and
I was
in
the States, and sort of going around from relative to relative. And a very unsettled thing, and then finally they let me back into the Republic in June.
Excuse me, by yourself or with children?
Well, the children were back in school, but I did have my youngest who had finally been evacuated.
I see.
But she spent the first 5 days of the revolution down there with this charming young woman I'd gotten to be her companion, and Kendall Montgomery she was Kendall Bailey before she married. And she stayed on, and she was running the household, and the Admiral McCain would come in, father of the senator, would come in and say, well, what are your orders, ma'am? And she would order the food for
this young woman.
She was about 25 at the time, and she would order all the food, and the Admiral would put the order in. And people were sleeping in all the embassy personnel would be the foreign service people would come in, and they would first come, first serve. So the first people would get the sofas, and then the rest there'd be a sort of a stacked cordwood dormitory in the dining room on the floor. They bring their own pillows, and that was it. And that went on for quite some time, apparently.
And then you were able to fly in, or how did you get in
Oh,
again?
I flew in.
Flew in.
Yes. And there'd been an attempt on Tapp's life, so President Johnson had ordered extra security put on, and he had the CID people, a team of about 8 young men, and we used to call them the Sydneys, and they lived in the house, and three would be on duty with Tapp. I had one who would take Victoria to school and back, and she would always try to escape him. So they always had a lively time with her, and I mean, they were fun moments too.
Sure.
But it was
Well, but it must have been very daunting when, especially if there wasn't a. Did you hear about this attempt on his, or they actually did?
I didn't hear about it till I got down there. It was interesting because I didn't worry about his safety. I knew that he'd be looked after that way. I worried about his getting enough sleep and enough food. His mother was firmly convinced that every bullet that was aimed in the Dominican Republic was aimed at him, and I think that contributed a great deal to her final illness.
Oh, that's too bad.
She was quite ill at that time. And by the time I got back, we had life had resumed a certain amount of normalcy, and we were giving dinner parties. The household had been very well trained that at the first sign of trouble that they were to bolt the front door. And the house itself was not exactly very defensible because it's largely French doors, and a sun porch, and it spreads out this way. Well, we were giving one dinner party, and all of a sudden there was a huge, sounded like bangs going on, and so front door was shut. Well, of course, guests were still arriving, so they were frantic to get in. And one of the wives who came sort of was vastly amused by me because I went whee. But we occasionally, so I say we occasionally came under fire, and contrary to what was written up, Neil Morgan, who was an Episcopal priest but also a journalist at the time, he took photographs of the holes in the residence building and in the office building where there had been fired on. And we had one on, I think it was New Year's Eve, that year, there was a tremendous sort of fusillade, I guess you'd call it, and the Sydneys came rushing in and said, "Get away from the window, ma'am, get away from the window." And I said, "But that's just firecrackers." "No, ma'am, that's bullets." And because we'd had an episode before the revolution where the same sound had happened, and I thought we were being shot at, and it turned out to be firecrackers because the Dominicans had won in the baseball team. So having had this experience,
you were just taught me.
And because I felt that I shouldn't put these young men in a position of danger when it wasn't necessary. The only outings I did, other than when I went out with Tapp for functions, I would go play golf, which it was fun because that very nice golf course, and I'd have it all to myself. There might be one other player on the whole 18 holes. Right. I got really spoiled that way, and the caddy master would try to come and teach me, and then the regular caddy would try and teach me something else. So I never became a good golfer, but I thoroughly enjoyed the experience. And of course, people would they pass on requests, and I said to the consul general, "Now look, I know perfectly well that I'm not supposed to do this, and I will just send you my card saying that I am closing such and such cars, and that I have promised to try to help, and you'll know, and you do. I don't expect you to do anything."
Sure.
But because I mean, people seem to have this idea that anybody will help them, and it doesn't work that way.
Well, but again, you know, in that kind of culture, often they have to count on the family first,
Yes.
and on the friends.
Yes.
And they know that those, you know,
It's all for the family, I know.
You know, I often tell, I teach here, one of the things that I tell my students, that in this country, and with very good reason, nepotism is a very bad word. But in the Latin culture, if you are not good for your family or friends, what kind of person you are?
Yeah.
So they are expecting you, if they have even met you just occasionally, "Oh, she's my friend, I have met her, and she knows me, and she's going to try to do something for me." And
which is one reason why I've always felt that it was a very poor idea to send somebody as ambassador or even lower ranks who had a spouse or was originally of the country they are assigned to, because it puts you in a very invidious position. I remember one, actually they were colleagues of ours of another country, but the wife was assigned to the country, they were assigned to the country of the wife's origin, and of course her family all were in opposition, and he was assigned to the government, and it was a terrible position to be put in.
And as you know, the families are hundreds of people, and they all can claim, you know, I'm your second or third cousin, but they all, you know.
Families are hundreds of people. We had John Latzis, who is now one of the biggest Greek ship owners at that time, was just starting up, and he had bought a P&O liner, which for the Greek trade between Athens and Sydney, and he decided to have a short cruise to Tinos and back from Piraeus, and he sent out an invitation for you and your family to come. The ship was supposed to take 1,200 people in the passenger manifest, and I don't know how many crew they had. And we got aboard, and there were 2 entire villages for one person's invitation.
Well,
and I don't know how many we ended up being. The food supply gave out well before. We didn't get back to 1 a.m. in the first place. We were having left at about 1 p.m. And it was a nice cruise, very crowded, and
extremely crowded.
Very
our
Greek,
relatives,
very
our
Greek,
relatives.
and rather fun. But the food gave out. I won't comment on the state of the restrooms, we finally got back. Well, then there was a stampede to get off, and Tap and I decided we would walk down the stairs, which was a very wise decision, because we looked at the elevators, which had an open grill effect, and saw the despairing look on our French opposite number, because he was stuck between decks because there were too many people in the elevator.
So you went just went down. So going back to the Dominican Republic, then did you or your husband write up memoirs or notes about that period? Because, you know, that in many ways, because I know the Dominican Republic quite well, and I still maintain there, is that what happened at that time was really seminal. It was really seminal to what the Dominican Republic is today. The Dominican Republic today is really a beacon of light, of democracy, and also good relations with the United States, fairly good relations. You know, Representative Ron Held of New York is very good with the Dominican, community that is there in New York. And I really go back to what happened in the 1960s that really turned things around.
Well, Tap used to keep a line a day, And I kept a line of day, but mine, I had a tendency to lose things, so I don't know whether I still have that or not, mine for that period, because we did it in 5-year
Sure.
books. And of course, I think Cheryl has most of that period
So
here.
it would be here.
It would be here.
Yeah. I have been told that before too long we have to cease and desist. Any last minute words of wisdom you can impart to us about your experiences as a former daughter of diplomats, wife of a diplomat, and now with your daughters and sons also involved in this world kind of culture?
They didn't want to have anything to do with the Foreign Service. The closest was my second son, who went into the Navy JAG Corps, but no, they didn't want to have anything to do with it. I think because they wanted roots, and that's one
Sure.
thing. I mean, the only roots they had were at my parents'
Sure.
summer house. But advice, well, I used to tell the young Foreign Service couples coming in, for heaven's sakes, cultivate your state representatives and your state senators. Because
They are key.
That was one of the
key.
things the
They're
TAP
absolutely
always
key.
did. And of course, coming from a state like Georgia, this thing is more expected and understood of you.
Sure.
And I don't know, maybe the culture on Capitol Hill has changed considerably, but maybe not. But anyhow, I'd say to them, do that, because it will be helpful, and it'll also
sure.
help the Foreign Service if you do
Sure.
it. So that would be one thing I'd advise them. The second thing I think I would say is just don't expect things to be the same as they are in the States.
Yes, please.
Look, although the
because
world is getting
for
much...
good and for bad.
The world is getting much more homogenized.
Sure.
But
Mrs. Bennett, I know you have 5 children, as far as I know, 3 daughters and 2 sons.
in the opposite order.
Well, but 5 all told. And one of the things that I'm always intrigued, and especially because you're going from post to post, different cultures and so on, were they sent to, let's say, the American or the English school? Did they go to the public schools? How did they cope with day-to-day? And you as the mother, how were you able to help them out?
Well, we, fortunately for me and them, I suppose, didn't go abroad as a family until the youngest was 5. They were 2-year intervals. We had twins as number 3. And our first posting with the family was Vienna. And I did to them what had been done to me. I plunked them in Austrian schools. They got lessons in German at home, but they had to sink or swim, and so they really got German tapped down pretty well. And the schools were good. And my eldest had been made to skip a grade in the States before he went abroad, and I thought at the time, well, we'll be going abroad, so it won't make a difference. But when he went back to boarding school at home, it turned out that he'd had such good preparation that he continued being a year ahead of himself, which he was not really socially prepared for, so he had a rather hard time in boarding school, and it worked out better in college. But we went abroad by ship, and I feel so sorry for people going abroad on postings because they have to fly, which means that you pack up your belongings and then you're off, and then you arrive and you have to go straight in, whereas when you went by ship you had a time for what I call your soul to catch up with you. And so you could say goodbye to your previous posting, and you'd have time to adjust
Have
the
about
idea of a
10
new
days
place.
or a week or so.
And it would take at least a week, and you didn't see your belongings sort of almost before you'd left them. We went by the American export line, and it was wonderful because there were 75 children in first class, and so they had a separate seating for the children. So we were asked to introduce our children to their dining steward, and he'd say, "Do you have any orders particularly?" And I said, look, if you can get some meat and potatoes and vegetables down them, it's fine. But if they only want to eat ice cream, I don't really care.
For 2 weeks, it's okay.
For 2 weeks, that's perfectly fine. We only saw the children when they were in bed, and I remember coming in. I'd come in at night, and the girls and I were in one cabin, and Tap and the boys were in the other cabin, and Anne, one of the twins, would be sitting propped up, ostensibly reading to Victoria. Ellen, who was always the troublemaker, would be pretending to be asleep. And that was all I saw of them. But it was one of those wonderful things because people still put their shoes outside of the cabin to be polished. And of course, one of the things the children would do would be to mix the shoes up.
Just for fun.
They rode up and down in the elevators. I mean, they had a glorious time. And that's what it ought to have been. But then the next time we went abroad, when we came back, there weren't that many children, and it wasn't nearly as much fun. And then the shipping we had to start going by plane, and it wasn't anything like it. But I was very fortunate because by that time, I didn't have as many children to deal with. But when Tap had this engaging idea that each child should have a bag that she would be responsible for. Well, that was much more trouble than letting me be responsible for it all. But anyway, we landed in Genoa, and I spent 3 or 4 days there, and we had our collie with us, and the lassie had just hit Italy, and these people would fling themselves across the street in the face of oncoming traffic. And Lassie, hugged the dog. Well, the dog was so glad to be on terra firma, he didn't mind, but it was quite something. And then we took the train up on a Sunday, and we did have seats, but we didn't know the ropes enough to get our lunch tickets, and so they announced lunch, and we thought we'll go to the second sitting. Well, by that time the train was so crowded you couldn't even move through the corridors if you tried. So we ended up taking sandwiches through the window at the next station, which turned out to be salami, and the children did not like salami. The dog thought it was sheer heaven. Anyway, we had to change trains in Milan, or rather we stayed in our car, but the train, we changed engines or something, and Tap knew this was going to happen. He warned me, but he went off with all our tickets. I think I had the passports and he had the money and the tickets. And our train started pulling out. The twins and those of us who'd stayed on the train were simply miserable with John and the dog and Tap. Were off walking someplace. And everybody was firmly convinced we'd never see Tap again. And I began thinking this wasn't so smart, not having some of the passports with me. But those trains met up again, and we got to Vienna, and we were met by the embassy. And of course in those days it was very much the family idea. Your section of the embassy would all come out to meet you, and then they would all look after you and take it in turn, and you had to pay calls in those days, and so they'd take you around and transport you for calls, and it was much easier than it would be now, where there is the family liaison office, which is supposed to do all these things, but it was you got to know people much faster, I think, in those days.
Well, because also the security, considerations now are just.
Oh, I know. I mean, I'm so grateful that we were where we were when we were, because we escaped most of that security aspect and being worried about it.
Yeah. Now, the other thing is the other opposite way. I understand and I know that your husband had several postings in this country.
Yes,
we Maxwell and so
on. When we left Portugal, we had the choice of the Industrial War College at Fort McNair in Washington, or the Air War College. And I we visited in Montgomery because one of his fraternity brothers had an older sister who lived in Montgomery. And that visit was so wonderful because they were so hospitable, and they even explained the family in jokes to you, and I thought, anybody who has the patience to do that, this is perfectly lovely. So when we were given the choice, I said, for heaven's sakes, let's take Montgomery. So
that was Maxwell.
Maxwell. So we lived on base. There was a house assigned, and we were on General's Row. And what was very nice was the golf course was the approach to the 10th tee on the golf course was right across the way. So my next door neighbor, whose wife was the commandant of the War College, and I would get the breakfast dishes done, and then we'd go tootling across with our clubs and we'd play, and we never had to wait. And the only day we didn't do this was Saturdays when the men got to go, and Sundays when the men got to go first. But I found it a perfectly delightful assignment, and because of Capers Holmes's sister, we knew a lot of people in Montgomery, so we played both town and gown, and I really have the fondest memories of that assignment.
That's great. And I know another one was, of course, in New York at the UN.
At the UN, and we had the rather unusual thing of serving under 5 different chiefs.
Mixed blessing.
Well, a lot of them were very nice. Our first ones were George and Barbara Bush, and you couldn't have asked for nicer people to serve with. They were wonderful, and they were marvelous representatives of the U.S. because they were outgoing and they were courteous. I mean, they were fantastic when it came to writing thank you letters. They would have them written sort of within 12 hours of the event, and that takes some doing. Both George and Barbara did that, and they did that through their entire time as even when they were he was vice president. And we had them for a family dinner one time, and one of the twins said, "Gosh, I wish everybody were like them." And and I remember another time there was some kind of it was a sale of African artifacts, and we went there, and I was with Mrs. Bush, and I thought, well, I've got to buy something, and everything seemed to be rather expensive, and I finally saw a sort of a ankle bracelet or something like that, and it said, so I asked what it was, and the salesperson said, "Oh, it's 4." I said, "Oh, well, then I'll take it," thinking $4. It turned out to be $4,000.
Oh my goodness!
And before I said I'll take it, and Mrs. Bush said, "I think, dearie, that it's 4,000." So I shrank back as though I'd been stung by a wasp. And said, "No, I guess I won't take it." But she knew from her African travels. That was one country, excepting for Angola and Mozambique, we really. And 2 days in Pretoria, we really hadn't. Well, TAP had been around the northern part of the countries, but I didn't get to go to those. So it was wonderful being under them. Then we had John Scally, who was the journalist who had been so instrumental in China. They were rather new to this business, but very nice people, and. But different style, of course. But we were very cordial, and certainly he was a good chief. And then we had subsequently Senator Moynihan, and he didn't have much use for the Foreign Service, and he did things his own style, having been in India. And so
sometimes he was very frank.
And but he was very effective.
Yeah.
And she wasn't very much underfoot, so that I sort of tended to carry things for the female side of things then. And then after them we had the Scrantons, and he was a prince of a man, and she was absolutely lovely. And so I mean, there again, it was a real pleasure to serve under them. And then we got a couple of months of Andy Young, and but by that time we knew we were leaving, and so it was a very
and Andy Young coming also from Georgia, so there was that connection.
Yes. And but anyway, he was bringing in a whole new team of his people. So anyhow. But it was rather interesting because I was born in New York, and when we came home from abroad, we would always come and stay with my grandmother, which was in New York, and she lived at Park Avenue and 67th Street. My parents, after they retired, eventually got an apartment at 72nd and Park, and even though that 5-block difference, it was almost a different New York. Well, we lived over on the east side when we were at the UN, and that really was a different thing. I had to learn New York all over again. It was rather curious that way. But it was delightful, and most of the diplomats enjoy New York because they can be very anonymous there. They don't feel they're in the goldfish bowl the way you do in almost any other foreign assignment. Of course, when you're double parked, that's another story. Our Turkish colleague, whom we subsequently had as opposite number at at NATO, was a wonderful gentleman, and we were sitting minding our own business on a Sunday afternoon with the windows open, and we kept hearing a lot of noise on York Avenue, and I said, "Gosh, that's a lot of noise," and the phone rang, and it was Ambassador Olcay saying, Tapp was the man in charge of host relations, and Olcay said, "Mr. Ambassador, I'm terribly sorry to bother you, but there's a whole crowd of Greek Americans, and they seem intent upon attacking my embassy, the offices, and the police don't seem to be doing anything about it. Do you think you could do something about it?" Now, that right there, he was wonderful, because any other ambassador would say, "You so-and-so, why couldn't you, can't you do something? You darn well do something." I mean, the whole approach was different. Well, anyway, then he called back about 10 minutes later to say that the matter was under control. What had happened was there'd been a Greek-American rally over in Brooklyn, and they'd all come over and were raiding up and down and acting up for the television cameras. And so forth, but his style was just so wonderful. Well, then I sat next to him at dinner not long afterwards, and he said, "Well, you know, I do have one problem here, and nobody seems to be able to solve it for me. I have a reserved parking space, but it doesn't matter at what time I arrive. One of our colleagues always takes it, and I've tried putting notes, and nothing happens." And I said, "Well, if you really want to get rid of him, just let the air out of all of his tires. He'll get the message." "Oh, I couldn't do that."
So it was not solved.
It wasn't solved.
But you gave the good advice, you know.
And then another Turk who was in the Secretariat, his wife had been one of the many granddaughters of the Sultan. She was a television person. And I forget what job he had in the Secretariat, but I guess it might have been protocol. Anyhow, he lived right around the corner from us. And we did have occasional cases of muggings and so forth in New York, and he'd had to park further away from his apartment than he usually did, so he was on the absolute corner, and apparently he came back fairly late at night, and he was jumped by somebody and who tried to hold him up. Well, instead of meekly, he just took his lighted cigarette and put it on the man's cheek, and that took care of that.
Well, this day and age, I would not try that.
Well, he's a fairly big, burly man, so that it worked.
Solved the problem.
New York was fun in its own way, but it was really a very intense pace, because we would have to do something like 4 cocktail parties an evening. I call them cocktails, they were always receptions officially, and then probably a dinner on top of that. And the only thing that made it possible was having a driver and a car.
Sure.
And that, unfortunately, has been taken away due to
budget cuts.
Economy from people, and it's false economy, really, because you were expected as the U.S. to appear at these things. I mean, one wonders what good they do, but
no, but again, they're representing the country, and it's a face so that all the diplomats and their wives or their staff becomes acquainted with them, and that may facilitate when there is an impasse. If they know each other as friends, they may not agree, but it's not going to be as heated a debate.
I mean, one was very conscious of that at NATO, because it was such a small. The then Secretary General Joseph Luntz, who was Grand Old Man of Europe at the time, he said that it's a club, and you knew each other, and of course you knew each other. Because it was small too, you were working towards a specific goal. You worked together. When the then Turk, who was there when we first arrived, left to go to the UN, exchanging with my friend, Luntz said to him, "Mr. Ambassador, you're leaving the club for the circus. It comes out better in French, but that was, and it was so true.
Yeah, absolutely. I can see that.
Luntz had a way of calling a spade, and he apparently got off the line that of all animal sounds, Dutch was the closest to human sounds or something like that, which did not endear him to his compatriots.
Well, of course, yes. I can see that. I can see that. So.
But but it was. I mean, most people say, "Well, he didn't come back to Washington all that time." And I said, "No, we had 2 postings in the U.S., but we only had Washington assignments in the beginning and at the end." And
yeah, because you had then Maxwell and then UN.
And then we had Washington at the very end when Mr. Schultz asked Tapp to stay on in the congressional liaison job. Mm-hmm. And that was one that when you have 435 and
plus 100
plus the 100 535 masters, it's a little difficult.
Oh, sure.
But we really enjoyed New York, despite the fact there's that wonderful picture that was taken the year that China was admitted of the 5 people huddled and Tapp with his chin on his hand. I think he was sound asleep at the time, but the unofficial caption was always, "What's the name of a country with 5 letters?" And
which nearly a billion people by that time. It was getting up there.
No, they were very tumultuous years in the UN. And one time Tapp was responding to the Cuban and said something about horse feathers. Well, that completely mystified both the Cuban and the Soviets, and they went around wanting to know what that meant. They'd never heard it, and of course it's not in any dictionary, but Tapp got great pleasure out of that. And, moving from abroad back to the States was really almost more of a cultural shock than it was going abroad, because you expected things to be different. But in the interval between the times that although we'd come home on leave and so forth, we weren't living there, and then to come back and suddenly be confronted, by no help to unpack with and so forth, and then having to get organized and I mean, when I say no help, it's just the not having another body around to help unpack, because Tapp was always at the office. So I remember coming up from Maxwell, we had a fair bit of silver, and I didn't want to bring it to New York because we didn't expect to be there very long. Yeah. And Tapp said, "No, we're going to bring the silver. I'll polish it," said he grandiosely. So the first Saturday we were there and we'd unpacked the silver, I put him there with the silver polish and the silver newspapers and so forth.
Remember what you said.
He picked up the rag and the telephone rang, and that was the end of his silver polishing.
You almost wonder whether he had programs for the default.
Well, I mean, I knew it wasn't going to last, but it was always fun. And,
but then when you moved to Washington, you still came to the University of Georgia, and he gave lectures from time to time.
We stayed in Washington, and he would come down and lecture. He would work it out so that he would probably be maybe 3 days or a week or something at a time.
And you came with him?
Sometimes I didn't. It depended on how long it was and what I was doing.
Sure.
Because that was one thing. I began being more my own person when we retired.
And not somebody's wife.
I said to him cheerily, "I married you for life, but not for lunch." And he would stay home for lunch, so he'd get a sandwich and salad. And I remember David Atchison, the son of Dean Atchison, and he were great friends, and they were lunching together. I said, "You've got lots of friends. You can go out to lunch. You can." So forth. So anyhow, he and David were lunching together one time, and David said to him, "I'm so tired of salads," because David's wife, had the same attitude.
So they went out.
But I mean, being home was wonderful as far as I was concerned too, because I finally had a place that I really belonged. And you have to realize that up until we got home, I had never lived as long in one place in the same house as I have now. I think the longest I'd lived in the same house for my entire life before that was 9 years. And so it's wonderful to even though my vote is only for president and doesn't really count much, still.
still. Yeah, right.
But
have you remembered what you wanted to say?
No, it's still.
In the middle of the night will come, and
we'll
have
absolutely
to come back and tape it at that time.
Oh, well, I think you'd also said something about, or at least Cheryl had, about some of the people we'd met that were interesting. Well, I think one of the really impressive people that we met was Joseph Luntz, who was the Secretary General. He was a great, big, tall man. And he was a real history buff, and anything to do with the Napoleonic Wars he could tell you, and he knew the uniforms, and every outfit that ever was, and he also had an almost inexhaustible fund of jokes. In fact, it was only after 3 years that I think that I heard him repeat a joke, which I think is quite a tribute to somebody. And then let's see, who else did I really, well, of course, Scranton and George Bush were very impressive people, and we met a lot of people who have become prominent in one way or another.
Did you have any relations with Dean Rusk?
Oh, well, Dean was the one who really, when Tapp went to him, because Tapp had great admiration for Dean, as did I, and he went to him, I guess, for advice, and Dean said, take NATO, because it's one of the last places where you will have some input on policy, which was the case. And of course, when we were there, it was we were trying to get the the small nuclear bombs.
Non-proliferation.
Yes, and we were trying to get them in Europe, and that was quite difficult because there were demonstrations not only in Europe but in the States about them, and and there were a lot of issues going on there. As I say, I didn't get very much involved in the political aspect of my father's training, and so because people always say, well, what does Tapp think about this and that, and I'd always say, I haven't ever asked, and they'd look at me. But it was true, I'd never asked. I had a pretty good idea, but I certainly wasn't going to volunteer it. And then, I mean, Tapp met so I didn't. Oh, we had a funny time in Portugal with President Tomas's daughter. He had an unmarried daughter who was about, in her 40s, I guess. And we were giving a dinner party, and so we were going to invite a couple, a particular couple, and our social secretary said, oh, you can't do that. And I said, why not? And they're divorced. And I said, well, what's that got to do with it? And the president's daughter. I mean, that was the way, an interesting aspect, because I think subsequent to that, to the revolution, then the laws on divorce got very much liberalized, and that conversation would not have occurred.
Yeah, that has really changed.
And then, I mean, we knew the tops of people. We knew the tops of the people, and in Greece, we of course knew the Karamanlisis quite well, and she was very much younger and a very live wire too, and they were great fun. And then, of course, we had the visit of Jackie Kennedy's semi-official visit to Greece, which in a way are the worst kind, not hers, but because she was such a wonderful export, people just clamored to see her and all that. But they from the logistical backup angle, they're very difficult.
Yeah.
But she was really wonderful. But
so did you meet then Onassis at that time?
We did, but at that time we were not. There was some, as far I never quite understood it, but we were supposed to stay at arm's length from Onassis and from Niarchos.
I see.
And so we didn't really get to know them, but it was very interesting. When Kreisky was foreign minister, which was when we were in Vienna. He came to lunch one time, and I guess he wasn't, or maybe, yes, no, I guess he wasn't foreign minister yet, but anyhow, our eldest, who was about 13 at the time, and very gung-ho, I mean, he knew what was going on, and so forth, was introduced. And so I think Kreisky was having fun playing and said, well, what do you think of the, who's going to win the election or something like that? And Tapp and I were sort of going this way.
Please don't say,
Actually,
please don't
terrified
say.
of what might come out. And young Tapp said, well, that's for you to tell me. You're the politician.
Well, he was already a diplomat, even if he didn't go into the foreign service.
He was quite good at fielding things, but we never knew for sure.
Yeah, but that's a very diplomatic kind
of... I was so relieved and so pleased.
Oh, sure. You had good training. He had observed both of you and knew what to say, and, you know, not to be offensive, because he could not say, you know, I don't know.
He was quite capable of saying, he would have been quite capable of saying, well, I'm going to, conservatives, of course, or something like that.
Sure. Oh, that's very good. Good training. Went from your parents, and then to you, and with your good husband, and now to the children, and so on, even though they are not, never wanted to be in the foreign service.
But I mean, one of the things I will say, the children were troopers, because we took 4 of them with us at our expense to Angola, on the trip to Angola and Mozambique, which the Portuguese government always wanted you to visit the overseas territories. And we went at Uncle Sam, Tapp and I flew at Uncle Sam's expense. I mean, that was made very clear that we had to try and pay our own way. And we would go to these towns I remember we were in some small town in Angola, and the local hierarchy, all of whom were Portuguese, they would have a dinner, and we'd be seated according to rank. The children would be down at the end. Andrew, a young man who was brand new in his career, and he said, you don't speak Portuguese, accusingly. And she said, well, I'm only here for the summer. Well, why don't, I mean, he just couldn't understand. And I mean, she was making do with a mishmash of Spanish and French. I think she'd had 3 or 4 lessons of Portuguese, but she was only there for the summer. But I thought to myself, well, I mean, but she was trying, and she was really outraged with his attitude. And but I mean, the children knew enough that they had to work too, that it wasn't all fun and feathers, which may have been one reason why they decided not to go
into the foreign service. Yes,
but they haven't really kept up their languages too well, and of course they had the disadvantage of being 5, so that at home, instead of being forced as I was an only child, and I in my day, you tended to have a governess. And I did, and she was Swiss French, so she and I always spoke French together, and at lunch, if my parents were home alone, we all spoke French. And then I spoke English to my parents. And so, I mean, my French was tapped down early on, and I learned my German, and again, because I didn't have the others, I learned to speak better in all my languages than they have. But that said, they still can communicate, which I think is the main thing.
Yeah, and you probably also had Latin, I'm sure. Did you not have Latin?
I'm sorry?
Didn't you probably have Latin?
Oh yes,
I'm sure.
Oh yes. I mean, when we went to Germany, for instance, I was plunked in the German school, but had lessons on the side. That German school was a private school which was run by either the daughter or the niece of Theodor Mommsen, the historian. And it was run for army officers' children and the noble class, so forth. And my class, it was run in the ground floor of an apartment building, and it went from Quarta, which would be about I guess the 6th grade up to 12th, probably. My class was a class of 13, the smallest class in the school. 2 Americans, one of them the daughter of our assistant military attaché, who was my best friend, and then an assortment of a couple of Fons, one of whom was the daughter of, her name was von Spiegelberg, which meant that she was Jewish. And when we first went in, there was no problem about that whatsoever. One of the interesting things was that the foreign mummy, as we called it behind her back, had a very German or Prussian cast of mind, because she assumed that because my father was the ranking American, that therefore I should be responsible for the activities of my fellow Americans. Well, there were several Americans further up the line in the classes whom I didn't know at all. Well, I remember one vacation, one recess, I was hauled in and put on the carpet by Mummy for the misdeeds of my fellow Americans. And so I was saying, yes ma'am, sort of thing. And then went out and was grabbed by my American sidekick in the class. And she said, we're not talking together, and I'll tell you all about it later, but we're not saying anything together, and Anna Marie. Well, they sat right in front of me. So it turned out that during that recess, Gerda was a Hitler Mädel, and she had been told she had to do something about this Jewish girl. So in the middle of recess, she started calling her names. Well, Irina apparently burst into tears, and the whole school sent Gerda to Coventry, which was extraordinary. And for the rest of that year, the only things we said, Anna Marie would talk to her, they were good friends, but the rest of us, all we ever said together was, pass the pencil please, or something like that. Now, the next year, that would not have happened, because by that time, Mummy had to introduce Nazi teachers, and it was getting, the handwriting was on the wall for the school too. And fortunately or unfortunately, the Air Force took over the building, and then the school folded. But I did get back on my way to India and saw the girls still, and but I often wonder what happened to them, because one I know was working as a nurse in a mental hospital, but a very frail person, and you sort of wondered why she'd chosen that. But anyway.
Okay. Well, one of the things that always interests me, how people meet. In my case, I met my husband as a graduate student. Both of us were graduate students, very poor, at the University of Florida. Florida is not exactly the best name here in Georgia, University of Georgia, they are great. But anyway, that's how we met.
Well,
how did you and your good husband meet?
I had been introduced to all sorts of people by various members of the family, and now you have to bear with me on a bit of a genealogy, because Tap's great-grandfather had 3 wives, seriatim, and my father-in-law came down from the first wife, and one of the daughters of the second wife her daughter married my mother's first cousin, and he was in the Navy, and I guess they met somehow that way. But that Adelaide was from Montgomery originally, and I think her father was a newspaper man. But anyway, so she decided that she would have a try at having us meet. So she was living in Ridgefield, Connecticut, and I was in New York, and Tap was coming up to New York for something. Oh, he was in the department. And anyway, she invited us both up for the weekend. Well, I was working on Newsweek, and my weekends were Tuesday, Wednesday. So I was desperately hoping to be moved up from the clip desk to research assistants in the Foreign Affairs Department, so I didn't particularly want to rock the boat, famous last words. But anyhow, I arranged, because she insisted so hard, and then he couldn't come. And she made the mistake of showing me his photograph, which was taken when he was 16, when he was most unphotogenic, and I thought to myself, well, that she hauled me up here. So 2 weeks later, she invited...
She didn't say, but now he looks better.
Oh, well, he became much more photogenic. But anyway, so 2 weeks or so later, she said, he's coming this time, can you come? And I said, no. So that was that. And then the phone rang on Sunday evening, and it was this nice southern voice explained who he was, and I wondered if I'd be free to lunch on Monday. So that was possible. So we went out for lunch, and I enjoyed it. And then he said, well, he was due to go to Panama, so he didn't know, but if he didn't go to Panama, he'd like to show me around Washington. So I thought, fine, and didn't hear, and I chalk it up to experience.
Sure, that's that.
And then suddenly this telegram arrived in the office, which of course everybody read with great interest, saying that he would be around.
No privacy.
So I went down to Washington finally and stayed with my aunt and uncle. And the first night was one of my second cousins had come back from the Navy, and my aunt and uncle had assembled all sorts of people. It was a grand mishmash of people, and Tap being accustomed to this sort of thing, and also having been had 4 aunts, was quite accustomed to this kind of thing, and so he sat through the eating very nicely, and then said rather plaintively, "Do you suppose we could go out alone tomorrow?" So we went out, and we went to what was then the Carlton, Sheridan, I think, or something. Anyhow, it had a room dance, and then we walked all over London, all over Washington the whole night until 6 a.m. And we knew it was it, but we also thought we had rather conservative parents, and that we'd better let it simmer. So it simmered until December, when I went down to stay with my parents in Peru, and the first I left it up entirely to the God. I booked my passage December 5 to Miami, December 6, because you didn't fly overnight. It was December 6 to Panama, December 7 to Peru. Got bumped, because there were priorities. I got bumped from New York to Miami, and that rather agitated me. But then I was very lucky, because the plane to Panama developed engine problems, so I was still able to get on it the next night. But of course I'd missed my Lima connection completely. But the ambassador in Panama, who was very fine, and Tap had been staying with him until he got his own digs, and he'd taken Tap with him essentially. They were very good friends. They're quite good friends of my parents. So they put me up. And by this time, Panama being one of the 2 places you could still enlist, Tap had very bad eyes, and the Navy hadn't wanted him. He'd gotten waivers from Admiral Leahy, but they said, "You still have the eyes, no thank you." And so he was able to enlist in Panama, and he was out at Fort Kobe. And he'd left his car to be with a friend in the embassy with strict injunctions not to drive it downtown. Well, they'd have been driven downtown and been in an accident, and had just come out of the shop, so I was to drive it over to Fort Kobe. And I noted, but I was going up to change my clothes at the embassy, and I noticed that it had gotten very, very hot. So I said to the embassy driver, who was guiding me around in his car, "You know, I don't think there's any water in there. You better check the thing." Well, it never occurred to us, but it never occurred to him to do anything but to pour water in, which he did. And I noticed it was getting very hot just as I was getting to the canal, to go across the canal, and which is where he was abandoning me. So I stopped for a while, and he came and looked and didn't see anything wrong, and so then then it started again. So I went zooming across the canal so as not to be caught in the middle when it went up for ship coming, and got to Fort Kobe with steam coming out of the car, and the Marine guards or whoever they were on the date was just sort of pushed me out of the way so I wouldn't explode. There wasn't one bit of grease on that engine. What had happened was they hadn't closed the cock down below, and so anyway, I can't remember anyhow, but we were engaged at the end of about 5 days after that. Then I went on to Peru, and he went up to Washington. But now he would have said that we met at 42nd Street and Broadway, 6th floor.
6th floor. Okay, wonderful.
But anyway, we really, it was a great deal of fun, the whole business of the life, and we both enjoyed it. And I don't know that I'd want to do it again now under the present way of doing things, but then it was, I really enjoyed it, and I must say I've enjoyed life ever since. So,
but also it always gets, to me, it gets back to the family you had before him.
Oh, I mean, I think it made a great difference.
That really made a big difference. If you had been totally had been
stone
educated
cold.
in this country,
I might
and
not
so
have
on,
enjoyed
so
it.
that
nearly
would
as
have
much.
been
No, I mean, I was very fortunate because I think when my mother went to Caracas as a young bride, my father had had a number of postings before that. She was 14 years younger than he. And she went as a young bride, and she was called on by somebody, one of the business community in Caracas, who'd been there for something like 12 years, or I don't know, a long time, and didn't speak a word of Spanish, and because she thought she was only there for 6 months.
Sure.
And my mother said to herself right then and there, that is not the way to go. I'm going to arrive, and I'm going to act as though I'm going to be there the rest of my life, and the first 6 months I'm going to do everything I can to get as close. And she trained me in that.
Sure. Well, she obviously gave you very good,
Yes, it
excellent
was.
training.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that the success of your husband's career, in
no,
many
very
ways,
little,
you know,
very little.
well, you probably don't give yourself as much credit as you should.
But-
I bet he would say otherwise.
Well, but I think one of the reasons for his success was we both patently enjoyed being in the place where we were.
Yeah.
And if we didn't, we
Yeah.
certainly put on a good act.
That's essential.
And I think you get as much out of a place as you put in, which is one reason why I think I enjoyed Greece so much, because I worked so hard on my Greek that because I did, I was able to understand more, and I really enjoyed it more.